The movie's finally released in Latin America and other countries, and it's already a resounding success. It surpassed all box office projections and is climbing the list of the most watched anime films of the year every day. For many, this film feels like a redemption for MAPPA, after everything that happened with the first season, which, although visually impeccable, left much of the audience confused by its cinematic approach. But beyond Jameson, what's interesting is that the studio is going through a strange time. For the first time in a long time, there are no controversies, no complaints, leaks or statements. And that's saying a lot coming from MAPPA. After the chaos, the accusations of exploitation and the wear and tear on its image, the studio seems to have found some semblance of stability. Now, with the trailers for the third season of Kaisen, the second season of Shigo Kuraraku showing an improvement in quality, and the movie Chino conquering theaters, everyone is thinking about MAPPA again, but not so much about its internal problems. And that's the question I want to ask in today's video. Whether Studio MAPPA has truly redeemed itself, or has it simply learned how to handle fame in silence? For years, Studio MAPPA was synonymous with ambition. It was the studio everyone mentioned when talking about quality, animators, and impossible scenes. They went from being a promise to becoming one of the most relevant studios in the industry almost overnight. Between 2020 and 2023, they produced an absurd amount of important titles. The list seemed endless. Each new announcement from MAPPA was news, each trailer a promise of spectacular animation. But in that race to try to cover everything, they began to break down. We all saw incredible anime, but those who worked inside saw something else. Impossible schedules, chaotic timelines, and a constant pressure to outdo the previous project. MAPPA began to make headlines not only for its animation, but for its inhuman pace. What was once admiration turned into doubt. At what cost was all this achieved? The breaking point came with the second season of Kaisen. Despite being one of the most visually impressive productions, the internal chaos came to light. Animators denounced extreme working conditions, endless hours, a schedule that was rewritten week after week. Social media was filled with testimonies, rumors, and even public apologies from animators who couldn't finish their scenes on time. The community that once saw MAPPA as a great studio began to see it as a reflection of the worst of the modern anime industry. A studio that shone on the outside but was falling apart on the inside. But paradoxically, that also fueled its fame, because even though the controversies were real, MAPPA continued to deliver products of the highest quality. The result was a kind of MAPPA effect. Each new release was accompanied by two controversies. One about how incredible it should be, and the other about the hell that was being experienced. It was as if the studio was caught between brilliance and over-exploitation, and the public, even knowing what was happening, couldn't stop watching. The most curious thing is that even at its worst, MAPPA never lost its reputation as a quality studio. What it lost was trust. It stopped being a beloved studio and became a hated studio. And in the anime industry, where names carry so much weight, that difference changes everything. So, despite growing without restraint, MAPPA had to face something it had never had to face before: its own limits. The scandal with the second season of Kaisen was not just an internal crisis, it was a mirror. It showed what happens when ambition surpasses planning, and from that point on, the studio had no choice but to stop, look inward, and decide whether it wanted to continue being a symbol of talent or of exhaustion. MAPPA made no statements, made no announcements, or tried to clean up its public image. It simply withdrew. And although to many, this seemed like a way of dodging responsibility, it was actually the first sign that something was changing. The studio decided to stop talking and begin to reorganize itself. In the following months, a clear change was noticeable in its way of operating. MAPPA, who previously seemed to announce a new project every 2 weeks, suddenly began to take their time. There was no longer that feeling of constant saturation, of having 5 productions in parallel with almost the same staff. The teams began to separate themselves more clearly, and each division of the studio focused on one production at a time. There was a small change from the outside, but a huge one from the inside. There was also a noticeable difference in the type of projects they were developing. The Shinsen movie, for example, was a much more restrained production, focused on quality rather than speed. Unlike the anime, which was worked on with a fairly tight schedule, the movie had more development, clear direction, and a more consistent visual tone. It was the result of a studio that learned to plan before promising. There was even talk that MAPPA had slowed down. It was suggested that the studio had restructured its internal hierarchy and redistributed some staff to lighten the load. It wasn't a revolution, but it was an attempt to prevent a repeat of the 2023 catastrophe. Instead of trying to rebuild its reputation through marketing, MAPPA began to do so through silence and stability. And it worked. Without all the noise, the studio returned to focusing on what it had always done best: producing high-quality anime. With each new update, with each new trailer, a firmer direction was noticeable. The trailers for the third season of Kaisen surprised with their level of detail and coherence, something that is not achieved when a studio is on the verge of collapse. The film Shining was confirmation that the talent was still there, but it just needed time. What is interesting is that MAPPA did not strive to give a clean image or sell the idea of a miraculous transformation. It simply changed its behavior, stopped making massive announcements, spaced out its productions, and began to prioritize planning. In other words, it went from being the loudest studio in the industry to one of the most cautious. The anime industry is rarely forgiving, but the public does notice when something changes, and in this case it did. The idea about MAPPA was gradually cleared up, no longer through statements or press releases, but because the results began to speak for themselves. The studio that had previously seemed on the verge of implosion suddenly began to show signs of control, and that control, that calm, was the beginning of something that MAPPA had not had for a long time: balance. Today, MAPPA is experiencing a different stage. It's not a perfect studio by any means, but for the first time in years it seems to have control over its own pace. And while no one has forgotten what happened during the production of Yuki-san's second season, the studio's present-day atmosphere conveys a sense of calm that previously seemed impossible. There are no more complaining animators, no more internal leaks, and no more of the chaotic atmosphere that accompanied every premiere. There's silence. In this industry, silence means things are being done right. The best example of this new era was James Offen's film, not only because it did well at the box office, but because it demonstrated something that everyone suspected. When MA works with a more relaxed schedule, its level is practically unattainable. The film, visual coherence, artistic direction, and narrative planning that anime never achieved. There was no sense of improvisation or last-minute fixes. Everything was polished, worked out ahead of time. It was the kind of production that couldn't be done if the studio was stuck in the same frenetic dynamic as before. And that improvement wasn't limited to just the Chinese movie. The trailers for the third season of Jujutsu Kaisen reflect a different approach. The footage shown so far looks impeccable, but most importantly, there don't seem to be any signs of a crisis. Everything indicates that production is proceeding more orderly, without the delays and disorganization that marked the previous season. If that holds up, the third season of Jujutsu Kaisen could be the real point of consolidation for the new MAPPA. The same goes for the second season of Shokuraku, which will arrive in January of next year. The first season was a direct victim of the studio's overwork, animators changing projects every week, impossible deadlines, and quality that plummeted halfway through the anime. But this time, the story seems different. Early trailers show a huge technical improvement, more consistency in direction, and a more orderly production pace. It seems that MAPPA has learned its lesson. Even decisions that might seem negative, such as delaying the second season of Dorohedoro to 2026, have another meaning within this new context. A couple of years ago, such a delay would have been interpreted as a planning crisis. Today, it's seen as a sign of maturity. The studio has decided to prioritize quality and development times over meeting impossible deadlines. And while fans may get impatient, these types of decisions are what make the difference between a studio that burns out and one that survives. But that doesn't mean that MAPPA has solved all its problems. The anime industry is still demanding and schedules are still tight. But the absence of controversy coupled with the consistency in its latest projects shows of stabilization. They no longer seek to be omnipresent, but constant. Ultimately, what has changed is perception. MAPPA is still a controversial studio by nature, but its reputation is no longer marked by conflict, but by expectation. When audiences hear its name, they think of impressive animation again, not labor exploitation, and that, in such a competitive environment, is a form of redemption. Talking about the future of MAPPA always generates curiosity because no other modern anime studio has been so exposed, questioned, and at the same time so admired. Today, with everything that has changed in recent years, it is inevitable to wonder where they can go from here, and will they continue to stay calm or will they fall back into the same dynamic that almost destroyed them? The first thing to understand is that MAPPA never stopped being an ambitious studio, the sea spirit. It is just that now it seems more contained, more aware of its limits. The internal restructuring was necessary not only to avoid collapse, but to ensure that they can remain competitive in the long term. The anime industry is at a point where visual quality is no longer enough. Deadlines, conditions, and team stability are just as important. And after several setbacks, MAPPA seems to have understood this. If they manage to maintain this new pace, the next few years could be the studio's strongest, not the most explosive or media-friendly, but the most consistent. They already have a foundation of huge franchises and teams that despite everything are among the most talented in the industry. They don't need to prove they can animate spectacular scenes, they already do that. What they need is to show they can sustain that level without getting burned. The MAP department is in a unique position. It has the prestige to bring in new projects, but also the bad experience of having seen what happens when you take on too much. If they know how to choose, they could become a model studio within the modern industry, one that maintains excellence without sacrificing its staff. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that their future will serve as a thermometer for the industry. MAP can maintain its balance. Other studios could follow the same path. On a creative level, there's also an interesting possibility. With fewer simultaneous productions, MAPPA could afford to bet on original projects or more experimental directions. Apparently, there are rumors that the studio wants to diversify its internal divisions more so that not everything depends on big licenses. If that's true, it could be the definitive sign of what they really learned from chaos. But of course, the risk is always going to be there. The family demands that any studio revert to excess. Now there's a name that sells, and that means production committees will continue to knock on their door with gigantic proposals. But now they have something they didn't before: perspective. After everything they've been through, they know that an impossible schedule can destroy not just a project, but the reputation of an entire studio. Ultimately, MAPPA's future depends on whether they can maintain that balance of transition and stability. And if they can, it's likely that in a few years we'll be talking about them not just as a technically brilliant studio, but one that has thrived in the face of industry pressure. If not, we'll see them repeat the same cycle of success, collapse, and redemption that has become so much their identity. Whichever way it goes, one thing's for sure: MAPPA will continue to be at the center of the conversation, but this time perhaps not for the controversy, but for showing that even in an industry as unforgiving as this, it's possible to learn from mistakes and evolve. Saying that MAPPA recovered its reputation sounds good, but it's not entirely accurate, because the truth is that MAPPA never stopped being an admired studio. What it lost wasn't prestige, but trust. People kept watching its anime, they kept being amazed by the quality, but they did it with guilt, knowing everything that went on behind the scenes. That contradiction shaped its identity for years, a studio capable of the best and the worst at the same time. Today, that perception has changed, not because the studio has made a miraculous turnaround or has become an example of perfect working conditions, but because it has learned to handle its own weight. It stopped, restructured itself, and understood that it can't carry the entire anime on its shoulders. And although it is probably still a demanding place, it no longer conveys the feeling of chaos. There is a bit of order in the air, and coming from MAPPA, that's already a huge change. With the movie Chains of Man, the studio showed that when it works with time it can exceed any expectation, and Usukai's Senten Free is shaping up to be another step forward. Yopporoku's second season promises to correct its mistakes, while Dorogoro's second season was delayed to be done properly. All of this spoke of a studio that, more than redeeming itself in front of the public, reconciled itself with itself. Perhaps MAPPA's true redemption lies not in people's opinions, but in its ability to not repeat itself, an understanding that unchecked ambition can destroy even the most talented, and we could say that it learned its lesson. So MAPPA didn't recover its reputation. It rebuilt it, and it did so quietly by working,